Okay, in this shot, if you're looking at it online, you see Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Um, Roosevelt doesn't look great. Like I say, he'll die. Let's see, March, April. He'll die 2 months later. Stalin looks pretty good, although he'll die in 1952 or something like that. And Churchill actually lives the longest. He dies, and although he's the oldest of the Allied leaders, he lives into the mid 1960s. So to go back to Stalin and Poland, at Yalta, he, Joseph Stalin he came to Yalta determined to create a sphere of influence controlled by the Soviet Union as a buffer zone to protect the Soviet Union from attack from Germany. And also, the Soviets had wanted to control Poland, if you remember, ever since the Bolshevik Revolution. You might remember that a Soviet army attacked Poland in something like 1919, 1920, and had been defeated. So the Soviets wanted Eastern Europe even before the end, even before World War II, even before the rise of Hitler. But Stalin's able to justify this now because of the attack on the Soviet Union, which jumped off from Poland in June of 1941. Stalin wants to divide Germany into four parts or three parts. France comes in later. He gets that as well. The reason he wants to divide Germany is he just doesn't want Germany to come back together and be a threat to the Soviet Union again. And this was pretty easy for the Allies to agree to. And later, France gets a piece, and I talked about before. Germany's divided up into four spheres of influence. Also, Stalin wants reparations. He wants money. He wants machinery to help rebuild the Soviet Union. And after World War II, the Soviets go into Germany and the area they controlled in the eastern part of Germany, and then they just take apart every factory that they can take apart. They take everything they can take from Germany back into the Soviet Union to help rebuild the Soviet economy. Now, most importantly was the question of Poland. So, as I've said a couple of times, Stalin wants control of Poland. He wants there to be a friendly government in Poland, and he wants more than a friendly government. He wants a Soviet-controlled government in Poland. But this is a tricky issue for the Allies, Churchill and Roosevelt, because the war in Europe in 1939 had started because the Nazis invaded Poland. That's why England and France had gone to war. And also the US, there was a large Polish population in the United States. And so basically what Roosevelt is able to get is kind of a face-saving agreement with Stalin. Stalin promises to allow representatives from other Polish political parties beyond the Communist Party in Poland into the provisional government that he will create or he's in the process of creating. And Stalin also promises to sanction free elections in Poland. So initially, on paper anyway, there's Poland's supposed to be a multi-party system. The communists would be in the government, but also non-communists would be in the government. Stalin promises free elections, and he promised to honor if the other groups besides communist Poles or Polish communists, however you want to put it, gain power. He promised to recognize that government, which is a lie. He never intended to do that in any way, shape, or form. But at Yalta, he promises to do that. And so on paper, anyway, Poland looks like it's protected, or it looks like Poland will be able to determine its own future after the war. But in fact, the ink that Stalin used to sign this agreement, it wasn't even it wasn't worth a thing. Um, One of Roosevelt's chief aides after Yalta said the agreement on Poland is so elastic that the Russians can stretch it all the way from Yalta to Washington without. And Roosevelt said, "I know, but it's the best I can do for Poland." So even Roosevelt's top aides knew that although on paper Stalin had made all these promises about autonomy of Poland, um, it it was easily under that he could easily undermine these promises, which in fact is what he did. And of course, after the war, Poland becomes a Soviet satellite from 1945 until 1989, 1990. Also, Stalin promises free elections in all the territories of Eastern Europe that the Soviets had liberated, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Same thing was true. Stalin makes these promises about free election. He doesn't intend to keep them. The U.S., for their part, Churchill, they agree that any governments that arise in Eastern Europe would be friendly to the Soviet Union. But again, this is all kind of very vague, and it's unclear. And bottom line, it's the U.S. and England, they persuade Stalin to make promises about the autonomy of Eastern Europe, which Stalin has no intention of keeping, and which the U.S., especially Roosevelt, probably suspected that Stalin had no intention of keeping. It's unclear if Roosevelt knew how sick he was. He had this great belief in his power of persuasion. He felt like he could kind of jawbone Stalin into some kind of post-war settlement where tensions didn't rise between the Soviet Union and the U.S. That he could convince Stalin to back away a little bit from his buffer zone in Eastern Europe. And of course, we know that Roosevelt's going to die even before the war in Europe is over. But even had Roosevelt survived, there's nothing he really could have done about Stalin's determination to take over Eastern Europe. And again, I can't say it enough, Stalin had the boots on the ground. The Soviet army was already there, and it was not going to be pushed out. It was just an impossibility. Even if the U.S. had wanted to push the Soviet army out, the U.S. forces in Europe were outnumbered. And, what would you have said to U.S. Infantry and the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force in Europe? It's like, hey, now we're going to fight the Russians. Yeah, it just Roosevelt it was playing a very weak hand, and he got these face-saving agreements about Eastern Europe that really weren't worth the paper they were written on. But again, he did get Stalin to agree to join the war against Japan, and Stalin did keep that agreement. Now, the other thing that Roosevelt got, pardon me, at Yalta was to agree, Stalin would agree to participate in the United Nations, the international peacekeeping organization that Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed to create in 1941 as part of the Atlantic Charter. And so this was a big coup from Roosevelt's point of view, that the Soviet Union agreed to join the United Nations. And of course, we have the United Nations today. I don't know, who knows about the United Nations? Does it do more good than bad? It's very criticized today. It seems very weak. Is the world better off with the United Nations than not? I don't know. It's hard to say. But at the time, this was Roosevelt's big plan. To stop another war like World War II, to create an international peacekeeping organization, which he called the United Nations. And of course, it would have meant nothing if the Soviet Union had not joined the United Nations. Stalin, though, did get one concession. And the United Nations, the deciding body of the United Nations is a very small group called the Security Council, which is made up of only 5 or 6 nations, and there's 4 permanent members. Well, I don't know if it's 4, but the U.S., Soviet Union, China, France, England, maybe. Um, and any one of those and other countries circulate in and out of the Security Council. But what Stalin got Roosevelt to agree to was any one country could veto an action on the part of the United Nations. So if the United Nations wanted to step in to a conflict and any country said no, then the United Nations was helpless. So this veto power, which has been used a lot by the Soviet Union, and to be fair, it's also been used by the United States as well, has hobbled the United Nations ever since its inception. And the United Nations, it was created later in 1945. The first meeting was in San Francisco. And then, of course, the permanent building was built in New York City on the east side in Turtle Bay in New York City. Beautiful building. So Roosevelt, this is something else he comes away from the Yalta Conference with. Stalin's agreement to join the United Nations, which was not a sure thing. It was not a sure thing. So Roosevelt doesn't come away from Yalta empty-handed. But as I said before, he comes back to the U.S., dies pretty quickly after Yalta. The United Nations does go through, but by March of 45, by about the time that Roosevelt is really going downhill, it becomes very clear that the Soviets aren't going to keep any of their agreements to allow for free elections in Eastern Europe. And basically, the problem of Eastern Europe winds up in the Roosevelt successor, Harry Truman. And in the post-war period, even by 1946, Churchill makes a speech in Missouri where he talks about the Iron Curtain that has dropped. I mean, Churchill was always great with phraseology, that had dropped between the Western powers in Europe and the powers controlled by the Soviet Union. Thus, we get the Cold War that marked international relations from the post-war period all the way up until the early 1990s. So Yalta, very criticized to this day. There's a lot of talk that Roosevelt should have taken a harder line against Stalin. That could be true. It's one of those things that it's not a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of situation. You certainly can criticize Roosevelt for what he came away with at Stalin. At Yalta from Stalin. But again, he was playing with a fairly weak hand. Soviet troops were in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt's #1 goal was to get the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan. He got that. He also got the United Nations. So basically, what happened at Yalta was an acknowledgement of just the power realities that existed at the time. It's hard to see that Roosevelt could have gotten any more at Yalta than he did. But that's an area that is subject to disagreement and has been since 45 and will probably always continue to be.